Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Straight Outta BS podcast. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. And I want to thank my Patreon members. If anybody's interested in supporting that in the podcast, just links are in the description. And thank you guys for everybody that has done that so far. I really appreciate you. I want to do a moment of silence for the person still suffering with intrusive thoughts or anything like that. So on the count of three, I'm going to do a moment of silence. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you for that. And with that being said, I want to go ahead and introduce my guest for the day. Go ahead and introduce yourself and where you went and what years.
Hi, my name is Mara. I was in a multitude of programs throughout the state of Idaho. I was at Syringa House from 2013 to 2014. From there, I went to a place called RTC in Blackfoot. I was there for a couple of months of 2014. I ended up going back to Syringa House from 2014 to 2015. I was there for just shy of 6 months that second time around. Then from there, I went back to RTC. They were shut down, so I ended up going from there to the Bannock House in Pocatello, Idaho. And then from the Bannock House, they needed my bed for another resident. So from there, I was moved from the Bannock House to Teton Peaks, which is a residential treatment center in Idaho Falls. And then from Teton Peaks, I was sent to a place called Cornerstone Cottage. I was in Cornerstone Cottage from the years 2016 to 2017. And from there, then I was incarcerated in the Idaho Department of Juvenile Corrections from it was later on in 2017 that I was sent to IDJC. I was there until May of 2018. And then from there, I ended up back in a residential program, Cornerstone Cottage again, for 4 months of 2019. And then I turned 18, and now I live on my own.
Okay. So do you know what led up to initially going to Syringa at first, and were you transported or anything like that? Can we go over that whole story of like what led up to it, and like if you were transported or not, if your parents brought you and that whole thing?
So I, at this point, was already a ward of the state of Idaho. My parents passed away my dad passed away when I was 4, and my mom passed away when I was 9. So I ended up in foster care after my sister could not take care of me. Syringa House became an option because I was in a therapeutic foster home, or called a PATH home, in the state of Idaho. And they had decided that they no longer wanted to be foster parents because they wanted to adopt the other foster daughter that was in their home. So they showed up. Secure transport. They said that they were contracted with the hospital. They showed up while I was in the middle of my school day. At the time, I was attending Emmett Middle School. And they basically sat down with me in an office adjacent to the principal's office and just explained to me what was going to happen, where I was going. I didn't understand why I was going. They just said that we feel like this would be the best option for you because there's no foster homes. So in secure transport, I was transferred to this residential treatment center called Syringa House. It is contracted with Northwest Children's Home, and they have facilities in Lewiston as well. When I then got to the program door, I was immediately placed on like a safety precaution. I was forced to, they kind of had me go into their safe area bathroom, and they kind of stripped down, so I wasn't hiding anything. And then they started going through my things. I then had an intake with the therapist. And then she told me that the reason I was there was because I had unresolved trauma and anger issues from my parents passing. and that that they believed residential treatment was the safer option for my care at that time.
Okay. I am very curious about first of all, condolences. I can't even imagine going through that. Yeah, I just like losing your parents, especially at a young age like that. That's crazy to me. So condolences for that. I was gonna ask you, like, how did that affect you? Like, and did it feel like you were? Well, I have a lot of different questions, but let's start there. Like, how did it affect you?
So my dad died when I was pretty young. I was 4. It was just a month shy of my 5th birthday. I would say that it had a bit of an impact on me because the only memory I could remember of my father was his passing. My father passed away from a heart attack due to complications of congestive heart failure. And so that was all I could remember because I was so young. So it was very traumatizing for me to just relive his death over and over again. But as far as my mother, after my father died, my mother became heart-stricken with grief, and she turned to drugs and alcohol as a way to kind of numb her pain. I ended up in foster care from the ages of 6 to 8. She got me back. We moved to New York. And then she had me in her custody until she passed away 2 days before my 10th birthday. I remember at first just holding a lot of anger and resentment towards my mother because at the time I had believed that my mother had chosen drugs over being my parent and that the few years I could have had with her were taken from me. And I remember being a very angry kid. It definitely impacted how I viewed the world, how I saw things, and especially like now as an adult, when the big things come up, like when I had my children and when I got my GED and when I started college. Those were the things that I wanted my mother to be there for. And even as a 22-year-old woman, I still want my mother, and I think just my overall upbringing, I said, just wishing I had someone I could call to talk to, and I just didn't have that opportunity because unfortunately a lot of my other family members we don't have contact for safety reasons.
Okay. Yeah, I can completely understand that. I feel that. So when you got there and they were like, you're here for like lashing out and the anger issues, would you say that was an accurate, like, nobody deserved to be there, but I'm just saying, like, because a lot of people get there and we're there for like, what do you mean? I wasn't like that, but like, did you feel that were you lashing out of anger?
No, I was emotional.
Okay.
I cried often and I struggled with depression and anxiety. Would I say that I was lashing out in aggressive behavior at that point? No.
Okay.
I was in fact just a very depressed kid, and I do believe that therapy should have been sought out prior to ever considering this, because prior to that, I wasn't seeing a counselor or anything like that. So it was immediately just, she's having these aggressive outbursts, so we're putting her in this group home. And that initially was not the case. I was just a very depressed teenager. And there were no safety issues. I hadn't tried to hurt myself or anything at that point. So it was just I think they said what they needed to say so they could get me a bed because they had told me there were supposedly no foster homes.
Okay. So they didn't make any attempt at all to get you into any sort of therapy. They just went straight to this school?
Yes.
Okay, this school, Syringa was what it was called?
Syringa House, yeah.
Okay, was it at points and levels? Was it religious? What kind of program was it?
So they called them phases. You had phases 1 through 5. Phase 5, obviously, you're getting ready to be released back out into the community. Phase 1, pretty much where everyone starts when they first come in. And I do remember at first being very confused, just by their level system, because it wasn't really quite clear how you would move up. They would have these treatment team meetings where they would basically just sit and determine whether or not you were able to, quote, move up their level system. But there weren't any really clear rules or guidelines. It just was pretty much when the staff talked about it and thought that it was I guess, the right time to move someone forward in their programming. Um, I don't. I remember phase one, you could have like your clothes and like basic hygiene items. I couldn't have like a journal or any like private like items in my room. Like I couldn't have like a journal to like a diary to write in privately in my room. Staff had to initial it and read it, which I always felt was very invasive. And if we wrote anything that they didn't like, it would be noted in your plan. And I remember like it could prevent you from phasing up. Like even if it's just like a diary and I'm venting like, oh, this staff member was mean to me today, that could prevent me from moving up in these phases. And I just, there was again, not very clear rules or guidelines. It was basically when the staff, and I noticed there was a lot of favoritism, and if it was when the staff felt like doing it.
Okay. Was there any like seminars, quote unquote, like self-improvement seminars or like things you were forced to do?
We were required, of course, to go to school. Some of us were allowed to go to public school. Some of us had to do school there, or they made us go to like the local alternative school, which was locked down and then like had like a specific dress code. And then we would have these like, they called them group meetings. And when I first got to the program, they had us split because there was 24 girls altogether. So they had to split into A group and B group, and we would have these group meetings that we were required to participate in every day. And we would basically, it became vent sessions. Like it would be like, you did this, you did this, you did this, attacking sessions. And unfortunately, they would often lead to violence between the other residents. Another weird thing that we were required to do in therapy, the therapist that was the therapist at the time when I first got there, she would do these things during these rant sessions where we were required to hug each other. And I found myself getting very uncomfortable because I didn't like being touched as a victim of sexual assault. I found it uncomfortable. I didn't want to do it, but it was a requirement. That's how we were required to end these groups, as we had to do a group hug. Otherwise, we weren't allowed to touch each other. It was only when we were all being like muddled into this giant huddle of bodies. So I'd have to say the only other thing that we were required to do was there was like an independent living group that really didn't provide skills on how to live independently. It was like, you would think when you hear independent living, you think like checking, making a grocery list, how to live independent. Nothing was like that. It was taught, independent living was talking about how we needed to behave properly to mold into society and how people expected us to behave. Basically, like, don't show your personality, don't talk back, don't do this. It was all about compliance.
Interesting. And how long were you at that program?
So I was told by my caseworker I would be there for 4 weeks. I stayed at Syringa House for a year, 4 months, and 2 days.
Okay, and then what happened leading up into where you went next? What happened with that whole thing? Did they just say, "Oh, you have no how"? I'm curious about this whole, because you were in foster care, right? So I'm curious, like, did they keep you in this continuous cycle of different programs and stuff because you had no actual like home to come back to? You were just a product of the system, like you could say.
Yes and no. So occasionally they would say that they found a foster home for me. And that's actually what happened after Syringa House. They decided that I was able to integrate into society and that I had graduated from the program. And I went to this foster home for 3 months. I didn't get a say in it. I didn't get to meet them before I went to go live with them. And unfortunately, damage had already been done. I was no longer able to function in a foster home because I had spent all that time in this group home. So when it came to like public school or it came to integrating into the society, I was not prepared. And a lot of the stuff that I had picked up on in order to survive in this residential treatment facility carried with me. And then after 3 months of being there, it wasn't a good fit anymore. I ended up in the psychiatric hospital twice. And then that's when they decided to send me to, that's when they decided to send me back to Syringa House.
So the second place you went was back to Syringa House.
Yes.
Yeah. So you had graduated Syringa House at one time already, and then you got sent back, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So when you got sent back, no special privileges, nothing. You had to start level 1, 0 points, I assume? Or
Yes.
on phase 1?
I had to start on phase 1, and I remember, if anything, they were stricter with me because of my safety precautions. And I noticed that there were staff members that weren't allowed to have like conversations with me. I noticed I was singled out pretty often. And the staff made it a point to kind of single out that I had been there. I was back a second time. And then I was there up until, I want to say October of that year. Then we had been told that Syringa House was shutting down due to lack of funding, multiple police coming in. The staff had become physically violent towards myself and other residents. Some of the girls were not being treated properly for certain mental illnesses. In fact, there was a girl there with an eating disorder who she just was able to just not eat, and they didn't get her help, and she passed out in her room. And I remember as a resident, one of the things that they started doing this second time around is if I was having a quote behavior that they didn't like, I wasn't allowed to go down to the dining hall. So sometimes like I just wouldn't end up being fed because they would forget to get me food or set me food aside. And if I did get food, it would be like crackers, and it would be well after everyone else has gone to bed. And there was a staff member who frequently physically targeted me, and I did end up retaliating with violence because she would hit me, and then I hit her. That is when I first got introduced to the legal system, and I ended up spending some nights in juvenile detention.
From Syringa House? They took
from Syringa House, and then I would go back once they determined, they're like, are you going to hit anyone again? I was like, no, I'm not going to. And so I ended up back at Syringa House. And then one day, out of the blue, I was told that my mentor, which was a staff assigned to me when I first entered the program, was going to take me out on an outing. She said we were going to go get ice cream. I was then taken to the emergency room. They lied to the head doctor and said I was going to kill myself and that I had threw myself out of a moving vehicle. And then I remember sitting in this bed, calm as can be. And the doctor said, you need to take medication to calm down. I was like, I am calm. I'm not upset. And I was forcibly held down and injected with a sedative of some kind. I woke up 13 hours later in this hospital room. At this point, I was in hospital restraints, and I did not remember anything.
And that was from Syringa House? They took you...
That was from Syringa House. And so in the hospital, they had told the doctor that I had been planning to kill myself, that I was suicidal, and I wasn't. One of the brief times I wasn't, actually. And so because of this, I ended up being sent to a psychiatric hospital in Coeur d'Alene called KBH. I was there for 5 weeks.
ABH or ABHS?
KBH.
Oh, okay, KBH. I was about to say okay. I went to KBH, yes.
They had me there for 5 weeks because they, quote, couldn't find a appropriate care setting for me. And then that's how I ended up in the RTC in Blackfoot for the first time. I was there for a couple weeks until like about a month or so. Just about a month, maybe a little more, until they found me a residential treatment center. That's when I had been introduced to Bannock House. Bannock House was in Pocatello, and so I was there for a couple months. at this point, I did probably need more mental health treatment than I was being offered. There was no therapist there at all, yet they claimed to be a treatment facility. There was no therapist. There was no, like, no one with a degree was hired there. There was a staff member there that was 18. It was her first job. And I remember just feeling like the staff weren't prepared to handle some of the behaviors. Myself and the other residents were self-harming every day. There was access to razors. There wasn't a lot in terms of safety precautions for myself or the other residents, because, like I said, it was not actually a therapy facility. It was essentially just a house. And then they decided to just completely remove anything that we could shave with. And I remember a lot of girls ended up sneaking in razors. We weren't adequately, like, there was just a lot of access for girls that had been clearly struggling with self-injury. There was a lot of easy access to sharps and easy access to things that we could hurt ourselves with. There was a girl who tried to hang herself, and she thankfully was not entirely successful and fell. But I believe had she been placed on suicide precautions and like been monitored, that wouldn't have happened at all. They just weren't watching this person. And she had access to like a bottle of Ambien. Like, they just didn't search rooms, didn't do anything to ensure the safety of myself or the other residents.
So this sounded more like a holding center until you got shipped to a different boarding. Okay.
Yeah. But they would advertise themselves as a therapeutic program. I was there until I ran away. And then I ended up I took off. I ended up in the hospital. And then from there, I ended up in a program called Teton Peaks. I was there for a couple of months. This was a lockdown residential treatment facility. We were required to go to school every day. We were required to participate in these groups. I remember being uncomfortable when we were asked to describe in explicit detail our experiences with sexual assault. There were only male therapists. The psychiatrist was known for kind of like drugging us. So like I found myself on like a lot of psychiatric medication to the point I started having seizures, because I was just on too many meds. And especially for like my weight, my age, my weight. They ended up tapering down on some of the medication. It was a very, think of like a long-term psychiatric unit. I don't know how else to quite to say that, but the treatment there was very punitive. And there was an incident between myself and another staff member. There was a lot of verbal abuse and name calling. And one of the staff members got in my face. I don't remember the whole situation, but I do remember right before I was kicked out of this facility, I was strapped down to a bed in my underwear for over 3.5 hours in their, what they called their safe area. And they strapped me down and took my clothes so I couldn't hurt myself. But to me, that was negligible because I was already strapped down to this bed. They wouldn't let me use the restroom. I sat there for 3.5 hours until the police came. I had to like wiggle my way to loosen them because at first they were so tight, I was having a hard time breathing. And I was, like I said, I was there for 3.5 hours and this strapped down to this bed, basically. And it was because I had hit one of the staff members. I went to a juvenile detention center, and then I was briefly released back to RTC, that program in Blackfoot, which was really more of a holding center, but there was such a significant lack of safety precautions. And again, they advertised themselves as though they provided therapeutic treatment. And at this point, again, not receiving any therapy, I was on copious amounts of antidepressants and antipsychotics that I didn't end up needing. And so I ended up being kicked out of that facility after a physical altercation between myself and another resident. And it is from there that where did I go after that? Yeah, that's when I found myself at Cornerstone Cottage for the first time. I was at Cornerstone Cottage for 11 months. The first time I was there, I was the 4th resident to ever walk into the door. It was a brand new program. There were lots of issues with favoritism, lots of access to self-injury materials for myself and the other girls that had struggled with self-injury. They said that they were a therapeutic program, but they were constantly switching back and forth between therapists. So some of us weren't receiving therapy regularly. We were fed and no one physically put their hands on us, but there's definitely abuse in other ways that I definitely wasn't anticipating, because in my head, because they were taking care of my basic needs, this was the best program I'd ever been to. But what I didn't realize was that they mishandled how they reported things. You know, when there were incidents, it didn't get reported until someone else outside of the facility found out about it. May 3rd of 2016, I was assaulted by another one of the residents. This is how I found out that morning that none of the staff members had been trained in proper restraints. So 2 staff members essentially sat there and watched my head get bashed into the floor, because if they were to restrain her or try to pull her off of me, they could go to jail for battery. I suffered a TBI from that incident. And to this day, I still have chronic migraines that come with aura blindness, as well as like light sensitivity.
What's TBI?
Traumatic brain injury.
Okay.
I was not given adequate medical care. So the other girl that assaulted me, she was allowed to go get coffee. She was allowed to go out and go get lunch with the owner. I was forced to sit in my room with the door locked, and I was on safety precautions. At about 2 o'clock that afternoon, for context, she had assaulted me at about 7:30 that morning. At about 2 o'clock that afternoon, I still had not been taken to a doctor. I came out of my room. I unlocked the door. I came out of my room and I said, I'm not feeling very well. I think I'm going to pass out. A staff member caught me because I got dizzy. Then they decided, okay, let's go to urgent care. Mind you, I was in no state to be making any sort of decisions. We get to urgent care. They asked me if I want to go to the ER. I said, I don't know. So they didn't take me until 24 hours later, when I started throwing up and coughing up blood. And I felt like my head was throbbing. I couldn't see. So they take me to the ER well over 24 hours after the incident. The frenulum in my lip was torn. This girl tried to shove her fingers down my throat. She was grabbing my throat, shoving her fingers down my throat to choke me, kicking me, punching my head, stomping my feet in. And at the time, I had been on probation. And in Idaho, when you're on probation, you're not allowed to defend yourself, because it's considered instigating a fight, even if it's self-defense. So it was to my horror that I found out none of the staff had been trained. So they had to just sit there and watch me get assaulted. I remember them telling me later, oh, we were supposed to be trained in restraints this afternoon, like the afternoon I was attacked. But it had been canceled because obviously staff was with me at urgent. They couldn't hold the meeting anymore because the other girl's behavior had escalated and I was in urgent care. I don't know when they had that training after the fact. We weren't made privy to that information. And I remember the owner telling me that I wasn't supposed to talk about it because it could look bad, because the staff should have been trained before the facility was even opened. They let us have pets for a while, and there were girls where their animals were running around their room, pooping all over the floor, and they weren't able to adequately take care of them. And so it very quickly became like a barn. It was really unsanitary and disgusting. I dislocated my shoulder. I want to say, what was that? It was December of 2016, I dislocated my shoulder. This was followed by a couple months of significant weight loss as I was struggling with an eating disorder. They were aware that I wasn't eating and they didn't talk to me about it. It was never brought up. It didn't get brought up until a couple months later. But during this, I dislocated my shoulder and I was given a pain script for OxyContin as well as and for Norco. And because I wasn't eating, it was very easy for me to abuse this medication. And it ended up becoming to where Cornerstone Cottage was essentially my drug dealer, because they were knowingly giving me this medication, knowing that I may or may not have needed it. And I was able to easily abuse it. They weren't making sure I ate or drank before I took it. And that went on for a few months, to the point where I kept getting the prescription filled because I was in pain, and it never occurred to anybody that I may be lying. And then, like, again, they knew that I was probably abusing it because I wasn't eating or drinking. And so it was very easy for me to get high off of the medication. And my eating disorder would not be addressed until a couple months later, where we had gone out to a place in Coeur d'Alene. I think it's in Hayden, actually. It's called Skate Plaza. I got dizzy because I hadn't eaten and I was exercising. And there was someone at a table nearby that offered me their wine cooler. This is, again, on an outing with this facility. And I drank the whole thing. Me, weighing at this point maybe 105 pounds, hadn't eaten in at least a day. I drank the whole thing. I got very drunk. I got really dizzy. I blacked out. I hit one of the canister bars while I was roller skating, and I dislocated my hip. It was only then that they told my caseworker that they believed I had an eating disorder. I remember, then fast forward a few weeks, my caseworker calls me the night before and says, "You need to pack your things. You're going to a program in Denver, Colorado." I remember at 2:30 in the morning, my caseworker showing up and grabbing my suitcases. We get on this plane to this group home. And I remember as soon as we get to the airport, there was a separate bus that picked up my caseworker and I and drove us to this group home. This was called, I think I forgot this when I was talking about this in the beginning, my bad. But this program was called Denver Children's Home. It was not a lockdown facility, but there was definitely a weird regimen there. They definitely weren't making us do school. They said it was useless and that we needed to learn how to behave ourselves and conduct ourselves in a more appropriate way. So we would deep clean the facility. And by that, I mean, we would scrub the walls, we would scrub the safe area, we would scrub like the floors. We had to clean the staff bathrooms. We started going outside, we would tear out weeds. So essentially it was a lot of manual labor. I do remember this being a program where we were explicitly forbidden to have any physical contact with any of the staff members or the residents. Like even a high five could get you tackled to the floor and put in a restraint and locked into a room for at least. So how they would do things is you would be given 6 hours to de-escalate and think about what you did. And then you would have to fill out this piece of paper. And then and only then, if you filled out the paper the way that they saw fit, could you come out of this safe area.
And was that like solitary confinement or something like that?
It was like, yeah, it was like that in a safe room. They called it their safe room or their quiet room. And restraints were typically, they involved dragging, a lot of dragging. I remember there was one restraint because I was crying too loud, apparently, after I got off the phone with a family member. They determined that I was having an outburst, and I remember being grabbed from behind, dragged by my hair and my shoulders to this restraint room. And I sat in there pretty much, I remember the sun was up. It was like 8:30 in the morning and the sun was up when I had been taken to this restraint room. I did not get out of that restraint room until it was dark out, and when I had asked what time it was, they told me it was 9:30 at night and that it was time for bed. So I had been in there for like 13 hours, basically. I missed. I was thankful because I'm like, oh, I got a day where I didn't have to do any manual labor. Because I was frequently sunburnt. They would make us go outside and basically just work on, they called it life skills, but it was just manual labor. They just made us deep clean this facility, scrub the walls, scrub the floors. And I understand a little bit of chores here and there to upkeep, our living area. But this was excessive to the point where like people's hands were bleeding. I had blisters. I knew that the person that I shared a room with had blisters. And a lot of people would be sick and we'd still have to go clean anyway. And it would take all day. And then weirdly enough, in the month and a half that I was there, they did end up letting us, they said based on good behavior, we could go on outings. They took us on an outing to a local coffee shop that needed volunteer work. So we spent the whole day lifting giant bags of like coffee beans. So again, more manual labor, but this time we're volunteering our time in the community. But of course, to us, it's, oh, we got out of the facility for the day. Again, I was sent to this program because of a supposed eating disorder, which at that point, it was true. I did have an eating disorder. I remember telling the staff members that all of a sudden, out of the blue, I was going to fast for religious reasons. None of them seemed to take any acknowledgement into that. And then I realized very quickly that if I fasted, I was going to pass out because I had been restricting my food intake. And so I went to a staff member. I said, actually, I changed my mind. Can I please have dinner? Staff member gave me dinner, but not without consequence. The next day, I was told that I had lost my donor privileges and that I was not allowed to go out into outings in the community. Donor privileges are when we would have people come in from the community and they would feed us. So they would come in and they would like have like an activity plan for us and they would make us a nice dinner. And I was not allowed to participate in those for a month. And I also wasn't allowed to go on any outings for a month because I had made the decision to eat dinner. So I remember speaking to the therapist about this and stating how I felt like I was being singled out and treated unfairly, and that I didn't think it was fair that I got punished for eating dinner. And as a result, after that particular session, he started meeting with me in a room that had a camera. And he said that he was doing it to protect himself because if I felt like I was being singled out, it's on camera. So everyone knows he's not treating me differently. But then he would make it a point to kind of humiliate me in front of the other residents and say like, yeah, her therapy sessions have to be on camera because she thinks she's getting treated poorly. This went on for like about the 2 months that I was there, and then I took off. At that point, that would be, I think, my third time running away. So I took off. A day and a half later, I was found at the Denver airport. I went into juvie. I was placed on interstate compact and brought over back to Idaho. I sat in juvie over here, and then they decided to commit me to the Idaho Department of Juvenile Corrections, which is going to get a little weird because even though it is technically juvie, there was a program that I went to there. It was called Solutions. In this program, we were
integrated into the juvie. Was a program.
Yeah, it's like juvenile prison. Think of like a rider program. I was there for a day, I think a day shy of like a calendar year. And in that time there, we would see staff like jump on top of residents to restrain them. In fact, there was a student who struggled with self-injury. And so rather than, do an appropriate hold to prevent her from hurting herself, they jumped on her. She got a rug burn on her face because they like slid her across the ground, the carpet. I remember when not being fed or us being fed food like that was not edible was a very common thing. And I remember in this program, I thought it was very weird that even though it is juvie, we were required to confront one another. So it was like, let's say you broke a rule of the program, right? I'd have to sit there and I'd have to say, hey, please don't swear. Please watch your language. Thank you. I'll get on top of that, was like the required response. And if you didn't respond to these confronts appropriately, you would receive consequences up to and including extra time added on your sentence. There were a lot of girls there that probably shouldn't have been and needed mental health treatment, but instead were treated with incarceration, which I think is a lot bigger issue than just programs in general in the T.T.I. I think there's a lack of resources. And then I was released to a foster home. I actually got to go in another foster home this time. She was incredibly physically abusive, but I was so afraid of ending back up in a program that I pretty much put up with it up to and to the point I tried to take my life. It was then and only then that I ended up in long-term psychiatric care, State Hospital South. I was there for 3 months. And then I witnessed a lot of staff mistreating the other patients. I was thankful enough to, I think because I was loud enough, nothing really bad happened to me, but I also could be in denial about that. I was there for about 3.5 months. I went to another foster home. They decided 1.5 months after me living there, they just didn't want to foster anymore. And so I ended up back at Cornerstone Cottage, which is where I ultimately ended aging up out of care. Second time I was there was terrible. I was sexually harassed by a staff member. He would make comments on my breasts, the size of my body. He would try to forcibly search me when I came home from work. And I would request every time to have a female do it. The female staff member seemed to encourage him to continue to harass me. I reported that I was being harassed by the staff member and it didn't get investigated. In fact, other staff members reported that this individual was harassing me, and he did not get fired until he was caught going through our paperwork. So he didn't get fired for known sexually harassing a resident. He was fired because he got caught going through our charts. Also, while I was there, it was very easy for me to access drugs because I was working 2 jobs at the time. It was very easy for me to have access to I still had my phone, and so it was really easy for me to get into contact with people I probably shouldn't have been. And although I had advocated for me to be able to have a smartphone, and if I didn't have my phone, I probably wouldn't have aged out of care when I did, there was definitely a lack of supervision and oversight that, looking back, it definitely needed to be monitored better. And I remember there was a resident there at the time that I was there who was very physically aggressive, and I watched her stab staff in the neck with a pencil. I watched her threaten to stab me and other people. In fact, she did try to stab me. I had a chair hucked at the back of my head by a resident, and there were I'm not saying I wanted this person to be punished, but like when I was told I wasn't allowed to press charges. And this was another 17-year-old girl in the program who was very fully aware of like what she was doing. And I remember being told that if I continue to complain or cause issues that I would be kicked out. And again, this is months, like just a couple months before I turned 18. So I kind of just did what I needed to do to like meet the bare minimum of requirements. And then on my 18th birthday, I had found a room that I could go rent in Coeur d'Alene. So I went there and I left the day of my 18th birthday. And I will talk about too, just like aging out of foster care, there are no resources for kids in Idaho at all. My only resource was, we can get you a bike so you have a mode of transportation and you have health insurance. I was given free health care by the state of Idaho because I aged out of foster care. But other than that, I was not adequately prepared in any of these facilities to turn 18 for adulthood. I wasn't given the resources I needed at all. And I actually found myself it was a very dangerous first couple of months once I first turned 18 and aged out on my own, because I didn't know what I was doing. I worked 2 full-time jobs to pay my bills. And I didn't know what my rights were. I didn't know whether or not I was allowed to report this mistreatment. And that's why for so long I didn't talk about the facilities I was in. I didn't talk about the group homes because I thought I couldn't. And then I recently just talked to someone about Cornerstone Cottage and how horrible that place was. So it's, I would say overall, it definitely shaped my upbringing, who I am now. And I definitely would say that I still have nightmares about my time in these group homes, because there was a lot of things that I saw, can't unsee, and there were a lot of things that I experienced that I shouldn't have.
Okay. Do you think the group homes were worse, or do you think that being in the facilities was worse?
They were all pretty bad. I don't think, because a lot of them have been shut down since. Syringa House was shut down for neglect, multiple police reports of child abuse, and lack of funding. RTC was shut down because there was an incident where another resident was sexually assaulted, and she sued, and they couldn't afford to keep the facility open after the fact. Bannock House was shut down due to neglect and child abuse. I was aware, Denver Children's Home was under investigation. I don't know whether or not they have been shut down, and I know currently Cornerstone Cottage is under investigation because other residents have been physically assaulted. There is a lot of racism. A resident was sexually assaulted there, and there was a lot of lack of reports and safety issues. Teton Peaks, I know, will probably never be shut down, even though what they did to me was horrible. And the things that they put me through were awful. But I do know that they have been investigated on more than one occasion for medical malpractice, mistreatment, and child abuse, and failure to report safety concerns.
Okay. What do you think the hardest part about being in all these places was for you, and how did you handle it?
I didn't handle it. I did end up, I coped with where I could. Food became a sense of control for me, which is why I ended up struggling with an eating disorder for most of my teen years. I struggled with self-harm and drug abuse, again, as a way to cope with my time in these facilities. And I definitely think just overall it did have an impact on who I am as a person. And I would say that taking an already traumatized person, regardless of what brought them into care, and putting them in these facilities did not help me at all. And I found myself more traumatized than when I came out than when I went in. And I think it was less about healing the trauma and more about making us more compliant.
Okay. And the RTC places, were they like points and levels and stuff like that, or?
Some of them. The Bannock House was not. The RTC in Blackfoot had like a red, yellow, green system, which is like, how would I configure that? It's like when you go into like a kindergarten classroom and they got the color chart with like the little clothespins. That's what I would have equated it to. That was their level system.
Okay.
What got me though was the way they would advertise themselves as therapeutic treatment, yet there was no therapy or anything provided for any of us.
How many people were at these facilities, and also were there boys and girls, or were these all girls only facilities?
So Syringa, all girls, and they can hold up to 24 girls. There were up to 24 girls while I was there, unfortunately. Cornerstone Cottage holds up to 16 girls. They're all girls. Denver Children's Home is co-ed, but we were organized into different pods. That's what they called it. They called it pods, and it was girls and boys, and there was up to, I believe, 60 residents could be there at one time. Bannock House could hold up to 16 women. It was only girls. RTC was both boys and girls, and they could hold up to 20. Teton Peaks is a little strange, and I'm going to explain why. Teton Peaks was also attached to a psychiatric unit called BHC in Idaho Falls. It's part of ERMAC. It's technically a part of the hospital. And so on occasion, sometimes we would take, like the way that they had their doors positioned, we could take beds from the psychiatric unit if we needed to fill the residential treatment center. And so they said at most they would hold no more than 30 boys and girls. Trying to think if I forgot one. State Hospital South was co-ed, obviously. I mean, obviously, any of the psychiatric hospitalizations I had were co-ed. I didn't even really talk about those because I don't really feel like they quite fit into the realm of residential treatment.
I mean, 5150s and like psychiatric holds definitely, in my opinion, fall into that category.
I mean, okay. If that's the case, then throughout in between a lot of these facilities, or even while I was at these facilities, I definitely was in and out of the psychiatric hospital a lot. I think I had 17 psychiatric hospitalizations by the time I turned 18.
Were those self, like, did you say, yeah, take me to the hospital, or were those like imposed, like 5150 type situations?
They were, so in some of them, it kind of varies. None of them were of my own volition. It would be either like my caseworker or like the staff at these group homes, or or there was one time that the police were involved and it was required by law enforcement. But most of the time it wasn't up to me. It was not voluntary. It was done by my guardian because I was a ward of the state. And there were definitely times, like in that situation with Syringa House the second time, that level of authority was abused. Because I didn't need to go. They lied just so they could get me out of the facility because they were being shut down. And I have discovered since then, I have come into contact with other residents. They did that to multiple of us just to clear the doors.
For sure. Let's see. So the majority of the programs you went to were in Idaho, right?
All of them except Denver Children's Home, yes.
I thought so. And let's see. Let's talk about like reintegration into society. Like when you finally got out of these places, like how did you reintegrate into society? Like how was life for you after these places? Like you said you were married, so like
found that I couldn't.
Couldn't.
And so when I was in these foster homes, it was very quickly short-lived. It was very short-lived, and it was very quickly interrupted because I didn't know how to function. I mean, when you have the, I guess, regime of a treatment facility, you know what I mean, and you go from that to almost no schedule, it's going to make anyone go a little stir crazy. And for me personally, I found that the trauma that I had endured in these facilities was so great that at one point I believed I would never be able to integrate into society successfully. Because I was like, I don't know what to do without this structure. I don't know what to do without the structure levels of these facilities. I don't know how to function without being like, and I was, on a lot of medication. So I found myself really just like not wondering whether or not I would ever be successful. And in fact, I had people tell me that I couldn't be because every time I would get out into a foster home, I would have an incident or a behavior that would end me right back up in these residential treatment facilities because I didn't know how to be integrated into society. These facilities don't give you the skills for that. They give you skills to be compliant. They want you to behave. They don't actually give you coping skills, things to help you manage your mental illness or symptoms. You don't actually get treatment. It is less about treating the trauma and the issues that come behind, and it is all about the behavior and and punitive punishment. And it is all about making compliant, quote, model citizens and releasing them back out into the community. I don't think any of those facilities helped me at all. So as far as like you would say, like integrating into the community, it was non-existent because I would very quickly find it short-lived. It wasn't until I was an adult that I felt like I once I didn't have someone else in charge of my own life, things ended up going a lot better for me.
So when you finally got out of the program, was it easier for you to, like, after what made it easier for you to, like nowadays, like, how are things for you? I guess I should ask that.
I'm married with 2 kids. I'm not gonna say their names for safety reasons.
Yeah.
I have a boy and a girl, and I have 3 cats. We live in an apartment. I don't mind sharing this because we're moving soon, but we live in Poland. And I currently work as a bartender and as a caregiver. And I'm currently in the process of picking up another job to just, pay the bills and have some extra spending cash for tattoos and fun stuff around the holidays. I have found that I'm able to get the help that I need when I'm advocating for it for myself. And see, when you are a ward of the state, you don't really have that option. It's this person speaking for you as if they're living your life. And I remember struggling with that so much as a teenager because I never felt like I got to have the authentic or true teenage experience. I didn't get to go to high school prom. I didn't get to go to these things. I ended up having to drop out of high school because I was moved around so much that I didn't have the opportunity to have a stagnant education. So I got my GED after technically finishing high school, but then there was an issue with the program that they offered. And so I definitely found that now that I'm in charge of my own life and I'm in control of my treatment and my therapy and like medication, things are going so much easier for me. And I'm not gonna lie, I still struggle because there was years of untreated mental illness and years of abuse and neglect, and also not even talking about the things that led to me getting into foster care. So it's just one of those things that I've found when it's something I can do at my own pace, on my own terms, I'm not being forced into or bullied into it. I found that things have gone so much smoother for me, and I feel overall that things have just ultimately turned around for the better.
Okay. If you could go back in a time machine and not go through these places, would you do it, and why?
I don't know. I want to say no, that I would still want the experience of, because it did help shape who I am today and the things, even like as a parent, recognizing the things that I don't want my children to go through and experience because I did. But also at the same time, I would say yes, because that is probably going to follow me until the day I die. My life is permanently changed by the things that I experienced, saw. There are just some things you can't unlive. There's some things you can't unsee, no matter how much time has passed. And so I think, I think that finding that middle ground, I want to say yes and I want to say no, but I honestly don't know. There's pros and cons to both.
Okay. Do you feel like if your parents had been alive like today, do you feel like you still would have gotten sent to a program, or do you think about that ever?
I do a little bit, and honestly, no, I don't think so. I think had my mother not passed away when she did, my mom was able to get clean to get me back. And I think had my mother not been diagnosed with cancer shortly thereafter, she would have stayed clean and she would have gone through the treatment she needed. And I think I could have actually ended up living a somewhat normal life-ish, as normal as you could in that situation. And I think that I think things definitely would have turned out differently. But overall, I love where my life is at now, and I wouldn't necessarily want to change the end result. Because had I not gone back to Cornerstone Cottage that second time, I would have never met my husband. I would have never found like a church community that I feel like I belong to, and I wouldn't have my kids or my cats. So it's just I'm a really big believer in the butterfly effect, that one thing can make so many changes and change so many different paths. And I'm glad that it's led me to where I'm currently at now.
Okay. What do you think has helped you the most to become like happy, like where you are now? Like what helped you the most?
I had to learn how to, I held a lot of bitterness and resentment because of the things that I had experienced. I was a very angry kid and I was a very angry person. I had to learn how to just, I'm not going to say I've forgiven a lot of these people because they were adults and they do know what they were doing.
Yeah.
But I had to really just learn that some things are better left alone. And it sucks because here I am now struggling where I do with the flashbacks and the things that I experienced, but I can't hold on to that forever. I couldn't hold on to my trauma. I couldn't hold on to the things that I experienced forever. I eventually had to learn to make peace with it. Whether or not I forgave them, I made peace with it on my own terms. And whatever peace looked like for me, not what somebody else said. And one of the things is just, I typically don't talk about it. And so it was actually surprising to me that I even agreed to do this interview or that I agreed to talk about Cornerstone Cottage specifically. But I find that I'm fueled by advocating for the end of these programs and facilities. And I find that I'm fueled by getting justice for these kids and like making this so this doesn't happen to anyone else. And that's how I make peace with it, is I take my turn in ending that cycle for so many other future youth down the road.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's so many people still in programs to this day. That's what some people don't understand that, but yeah, there's still a lot of people in programs to this day that are getting abused and stuff like that. So we got to keep on, being loud and making this advocacy heard and whatnot. I also wanted to say that I commend you strongly. Like I couldn't even imagine not having my parents. Like I have both of my parents still, and but they're getting to that age where I don't know how much longer both of them have. So it's just I can't imagine that. And so I commend you, and thank you so much for coming on the show. And if you also, I just wanted to say closing thoughts. Is there anything else you want people to know about your experience, or anything you might tell a parent thinking about sending their kid to a program like this?
Actually, yeah. I want any foster parents, caseworkers, state advocates, anyone that may see this video or listen to this podcast. I want them to take one thing away from my experience, is that there is nothing worse than sending your child to a facility when you breed compliance out of fear, it is not because we get better. And there is nothing worse than essentially terrifying someone into listening to you and to doing what you want. And I believe there are so many more effective ways of working with these teenagers and these kids. Because some of them are really kids. Like there was one facility I was at, the youngest girl was 8. So it's just, you don't know the lasting damage this will cause. And I know things may seem scary and rough, and you may feel like you have no other option. But I can promise you there was always another avenue. Don't do to them what was done to me.
Okay. Amen. Amen to that, for sure. And I also wanted to say, if you ever want to come on the show again and, do a part 2, just let me know. And I'm more than willing. So, there's a lot of people that contact me after they do the first one and they're like, that felt really good, and I want to talk about some more. So just let me know. And we can make it happen.
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for those that are still watching, just make sure you hit the like button, and we will catch you next time. Thank you so much, and we will catch you later. Bye. All right.